A tulip is no replace for a jewel, but I'm giving it to you anyway. Written by Monochrome Phoenix. Read by Arashi. Why are you wasting time on such a trivial thing? Arvel had asked Shez late one evening. What? The love thing? Shez asked, looking up from her work to see the spectral form of her friend perched on her desk. Yes, that. Why are you mortals so obsessed with romantic love? Arvel mused, their tone that of genuine curiosity. That's what I'm trying to answer, if you weren't paying attention, Shez huffed, strongly resisting the urge to flick Arvel's head. She knew from personal experience that her hand would phase straight through, and Arvel would make their stupid, smug face. Fine, fine. Now that you've spent far too much time asking questions when you could have been training for, I don't know, the literal war, what's your answer? My answer? Geez, that's kind of hard. I guess people like it because it provides stability? And devotion to a person or cause is important to people who live life fighting. That's surprisingly wise, coming from you. Arvel nodded sagely. The last bit was uncalled for. They continued before Shez could protest. So what about you, partner? Are you in love, as they call it? Arvel, I'm rubbing off on you if you're asking it so well, Shez laughed, and Arvel glared at her. It's not my fault I've been stuck in your head while you think about this. Now stop dodging the question. I suppose it's only fair that I have to answer. But I don't know. I don't think I am. I love many people in camp, but so far I haven't related to any of the stories I've been told. Arvel frowned a little. Does that make you upset? Not really. I have you and my friends, and if I'm going to fall in love, it'll happen when it happens. Always the optimist, Arvel sighed, a fond smile on their face. You will tell me if you do, though. Huh? Of course I will, Shez beamed. We're partners after all. Yes, of course. Arvel slid off the desk. We should rest soon. Tomorrow, can you do me a favor? What favor? Ask Hubert the question. According to the laws of comedy, he is the most likely to be hopelessly in love. Arvel had their signature smug smile, like that of a cat who'd just broken into the pantry. That or steal his notebook. I'm almost entirely sure he'd keep a record of who's dating who. Unable to ignore Arvel's request, or her own burning curiosity, Shez found herself approaching Hubert's desk early that next morning. True to form, he was already sitting there with a pile of paperwork and a cup of coffee that was growing steadily colder. Hubert, good morning. I assume you're here to inquire about my love life? Hubert sighed, not even glancing up. If you really have nothing better to do than ask about people's private lives, I'm sure I can find some work for you. Bandit camps always need clearing out, after all. Shez pouted a little. Under no circumstances did she want extra work. Oh, unless the pay was doubled. But even then... Oh, right. Hubert, come on. Can't you indulge your dear friend for 30 seconds? Judging by your record, it would take a little longer than 30 seconds. Also, what makes you think I consider you a dear friend, as you put it? Hubert actually looked at Shez this time. His expression was one of annoyance, but it was lacking any actual malice. He liked to think he did, but he really didn't fool anyone. Oh, come on. It's harmless information, Shez huffed. Hubert merely scoffed and rolled his eyes. Fine. Shez would try a different tactic. You in love with Edelgard? Hubert paused his movements entirely, his cup of coffee halfway to his lips. He stared at Shez, seemingly intent on making sure he didn't mishear the question. Shez just smiled, staring back. Eventually, he sighed. Why must everyone assume my feelings for Her Majesty are romantic? I would agree that to love someone and to devote yourself to them platonically is far more powerful. But your question. I do love her, yes, but our bonds have always remained strictly platonic and perhaps familial. Shez nodded. I didn't think so anyway, but it's good to check. I think you're right, though, about the platonic bonds being a stronger thing at least. I'm glad you think so. Hubert actually took a gulp of his coffee this time. So, Shez began, as soon as Hubert placed the coffee cup back on the table. Who do you love, then? And you assume I love someone because... Because the voice in her head thought it would be funny, but that was not a very good explanation, no matter how many things in life it applied to, and it applied to a lot. Because instead of denying me outright, you've been misdirecting, Shez decided to respond. By the way Hubert's eyes shifted, she must have hit the nail on the head. You're a lot wiser than I gave you credit for, Hubert nodded once. Why did everyone always say that? Shez was totally wise. Hubert continued. I suppose it would do no harm to tell you, provided that you agree not to gossip. No problem. This stays between you and me, and Arvel, but Hubert didn't need to know that part. Lady Edelgard, are you certain? Hubert inquired, his head bowed. He and Edelgard were having their usual strategy meeting, except this time they were joined by none other than Ferdinand. Hubert wasn't certain he was in his best mind for strategy, considering the circumstances, but still. I am aware that splitting our attention in the current climate is a bad idea, which is why I have no choice but to send just the two of you. Edelgard sighed and placed one hand upon her head, before continuing. We cannot ignore our ideals because it's convenient. That means treating commoners the same as nobles, hence why this is an issue. It's precisely because of the current situation that we have to help. If we don't, we're not much better than what we're replacing. Those were surprisingly wise words, coming from him. On the other hand, he was also being rather chipper for a man planning the murder of his own father. Actually, perhaps Hubert couldn't comment on that particular fact. As you wish. Hubert simply nodded, then straightened up. Thank you both. Ferdinand, please go and prepare anything you will need. Hubert, may I have a moment? Ferdinand bowed and left, and Hubert stepped closer to Edelgard. What is it, your majesty? I have a bad feeling that they are involved in this somehow. Please remain cautious. I can't have my 2 jewels cracking on me, can I? Edelgard's face remained serious. I can't have my 2 jewels cracking on me, can I? Edelgard's face remained serious, but her eyes were filled with mirth. Hubert scowled. Please, that's a ridiculous nickname, but I will remain ever vigilant. I've grown rather fond of the name myself. You're dismissed, Hubert. Stay safe. That is how Hubert found himself traveling across half the empire, with no one but Ferdinand for company. He was perfectly aware that the reasoning was sound. The main army had to continue claiming the areas around Fort Mercius, and 2 people would be able to travel to Hrim territory and back before the main assault with no issue. He knew that the other generals would be able to function perfectly and protect Her Majesty, while sending himself and Ferdinand would be the fastest to ensure the merchant union felt supported by the Empire. He understood all that, but he did not need to enjoy it. The task they were set was simple on the outside. Assist the merchant union from Hrim territory with brigand issues, then work with the merchants to ensure that it does not happen again. Tasks that looked simple rarely ended up being so, from Hubert's experience. You seem unusually lost in thought, Hubert. Ferdinand slowed his horse down so she was trotting in pace with Hubert's. Both horses had names Ferdinand insisted on, but Hubert remembered neither. I am simply reflecting on how this task is a waste of time, Hubert tisked. Ferdinand shot a glance at Hubert. I, for one, am grateful for it. Would you truly rather be stuck with the tedious tasks involved in creating a siege? Ferdinand sounded genuinely curious. Hubert was convinced he was just getting cold feet. I do not feel comfortable being away from Lady Edelgard's side for such a period of time. Hubert simply responded, then urged his horse to speed up. Ferdinand immediately matched that pace as well. You should not be pushing them. If they tire on the way to Hrim, they will struggle getting us back. It is the fastest way to travel, believe me. We will return to Edelgard within a week. Hubert chose to remain silent. It turned out that the brigand problem was negligible. Once they had located their base, there were just 8 thieves involved. Suffice to say, Hubert and Ferdinand dispatched them with no more than scratches sustained. He was loath to admit it, but the 2 of them worked extremely well together. He would never say that out loud, lest he be sent on missions with him more often. Yet when Ferdinand turned to him with a beaming smile, Hubert could not resist giving the smallest smile in return. Most people seemed to view Hubert's smile as ominous, or even a threat, but not Ferdinand. He seemed to view it in a positive light. I must thank you for accompanying me. They stood no chance against us. It was simply a matter of flattery. Hubert shook his head, but allowed himself pride at their victory. However, I must thank you for accompanying me. They stood no chance against us. It was simply a matter of efficiency. Hubert shook his head, but allowed himself pride at their victory. However, I must make condemnations when they are due. You were at the top of your form today. Hubert von Vestra? Complimenting me? To think I'd live to see the day ALL froze over. Ferdinand laughed, and Hubert scoffed. I take it back. Oh, come now. They squabbled most of the way back, although they were like this all the time. It was different to how they used to be. They had both lost a lot of the malice behind it, and at this point, it was almost friendly. Hubert wanted to roll his eyes at the thought. He was not friends with Ferdinand. He had just learned to put up with him. That was all. Your problem has been dealt with, Hubert drawled to the spokesperson who had come to meet with them. We couldn't be more grateful." The merchant made a sweeping bow. "We are in your eternal debt." "Please, do not be so dramatic. It was simply our duty to protect you in any way we can." Ferdinand nodded his head. It was extremely slight, but his demeanor shifted when working with politics. It was quite impressive, actually. Despite Hubert's qualms, Ferdinand made for a good leader. Not as good as Edelgard, but up there. "Still, you must let us thank you. We shall throw a grand feast tonight, with you as our guests. You must join us." "We'd love to, but we really must return." "We'll attend." Hubert cut Ferdinand off. "We can delay our departure by a few hours, I'm sure." Once the merchant left, Ferdinand rounded on Hubert. "Weren't you the one wanting to rush us? What's with the sudden change of heart?" "Don't you think this is incredibly suspicious?" Hubert hissed out, his voice barely above a whisper. "Their problem was solved easily, and suddenly we're invited to festivities. I think it's unlikely that it takes a scant few hours to prepare a feast, but yet that's what's been promised." "So you think it's a trap?" At least he caught on quickly. "All the more reason for us to leave." "No, we have an advantage right now. If we flee, we lose track of them and they'll simply lay another trap. But if we attend, we can prevent future issues. Or perhaps I'm wrong, in which we'd only be a few hours behind schedule." Ferdinand considered the information, then nodded hesitantly. "I see your point. I do hope you're wrong, though. Although you are not often wrong, so I shall expect the worst." "Indeed," Hubert nodded. "Was that a compliment?" "Perish the thought. It is merely a fact of life." As night fell, Hubert and Ferdinand made their way to the town square. They left their horses and most of their equipment out of town. It had taken a bit of effort, but they had both cleaned themselves up to look as presentable as possible. Even if it was a trap, it wouldn't do for people so closely associated with Edelgard to be unseemly at a public event. As they arrived, they found the area full of music and dancing, Hubert's least favorite kind of event. "Act normal, but stay alert," Hubert whispered into Ferdinand's ear, then spoke at a normal volume. "It seems they have outdone themselves. Unfortunate, as we can only stay for a short while. But we should appreciate it while we can," Ferdinand smiled. "Food? Not yet. It could be poisoned. He did not want to have to deal with the poisoning tonight. "Well then, Hubert, will you dance with me?" "Dance? Me?" Hubert was taken aback. "Absolutely not." "But why not? Surely it is the best way to experience the venue." "I prefer to experience these things from the side. I won't hold you back from enjoying yourself, however." "I shall. Call me if you need anything." With a final smile, Ferdinand made his way into the people. Good. He was out of the way, and talking with others was much more his forte anyway. Hubert slunk back to the very edge of the festivities, keeping watch for anything. He belonged there, in the shadows, but that didn't stop him from watching Ferdinand, joyful and smiling, in a crowd of people. He would never belong there, but he could appreciate the scene from afar. Quite some time had passed, and Hubert was almost ready to consider himself incorrect. He could see that Ferdinand was slowly making his way through the crowd to rejoin him. Perhaps it was just about time to leave. Except, in the corner of his eye, he saw a glint from a rooftop. He did not stop and think. He moved on instinct alone. He ran into the crowd, shoving past people. Many stopped to look at him, but he paid them no heed. "Hubert, what are you—" As soon as Hubert reached Ferdinand, he wasted no time with words. He grabbed him by the arm and pulled him along, barely slowing down. "Can you please explain?" Ferdinand huffed, following Hubert. Hubert opened his mouth to explain, but a glint from the same spot as earlier stopped him. He shoved Ferdinand to the floor, dropping to the ground himself. And not a moment too soon, an arrow sailed through where they had once been and embedded itself into a wall. "There's your explanation," Hubert hissed, jumping back to his feet. Ferdinand followed suit, on high alert. "Thank you. I trust you've got an escape route?" "Of course." Hubert smiled, ever so ominously, and began making his way to an alleyway. The people around who had noticed the arrow were beginning to panic, and it wouldn't be long before it spread. They had to leave now. Every few steps, Hubert glanced over his shoulder to ensure Ferdinand remained behind him. When they reached the alley, Hubert pulled Ferdinand into the shadows. "There's at least 2 archers. Probably more," Hubert whispered. "There's a few people in the crowd who were armed as well," Ferdinand whispered back. "The plan? We act like we're running, but we're loud about it. When we're clear of town, we fight." "Fight with what, exactly? We're both unarmed." "Firstly, I am never unarmed." Hubert rolled his eyes, then glared at Ferdinand. "But are you telling me you have nothing? You made it very clear to be presentable. Bringing weapons is not presentable. I also told you this was a trap." Hubert focused on keeping his voice as quiet as he could, although calling him annoyed would be an understatement. Begrudgingly, Hubert removed 2 of his hidden daggers and offered them to Ferdinand. "I see you clearly have no such qualms. But thank you." Ferdinand took them. At least he looked like he was prepared to use them. Hubert took another dagger out, holding it himself. It would be foolish to waste his magic now. "On my count." They slipped through the streets of town. There were far more enemies than expected, and after barely 2 streets, Hubert's gloves were already coated in blood. He slit the throat of a man wielding a sword that reeked of poison, then kicked the body aside. "Be careful. Most of them appear to be utilizing poison," Hubert called to Ferdinand, who had just finished dispatching another potential assailant. "Just excellent," he sighed. "How long until we start drawing attention?" "Give it a few more streets. We want to continue quietly for as long as possible," Hubert said, wiping his blade on the corpse's shirt. "Understood," Ferdinand nodded, and they continued. Hubert was shocked at Ferdinand's ability for this. He was the last person Hubert considered when he thought about backstreet assassination. Yet here he was. What Hubert had learned on this little excursion was that he could call upon Ferdinand more often, which was unfortunate for him, as Ferdinand often gave him a headache. But the benefits for the bigger picture far outweighed that. And he didn't mind Ferdinand. Not really. The 2 ran for the tree line as fast as they could, countless footsteps thundering behind them. Hubert had underestimated. Badly. This wasn't just a small group. Those who slither in the dark had hired mercenaries, and the full force of both parties was bearing towards them. Without looking, Hubert threw a blast of dark magic behind him. Judging by the thud, it had hit someone, but still barely a dent. Ferdinand ran slightly ahead of Hubert, making sure the path was clear, which, thankfully, it was. They reached the trees and ran straight into the thick of the forest, intent on losing their pursuers. "So, the plan?" asked Ferdinand. He seemed barely out of breath, which Hubert could not relate to. He was a mage, unfit for sprinting, as much as I hate to admit it. As he was indeed scowling. "We should retreat. We at least know the truth now, and it would be prudent to remain alive." "Definitely a fan of remaining alive." Ferdinand nodded. The 2 moved slowly, intent on making no noise as they moved through the underbrush. It was a roundabout route, but it was the safest choice. They soon reached their horses, who looked anxious probably. Hubert wasn't the best to judge that. An archer jumped out of the bushes. They shot an arrow. Hubert threw a spell. 2 things then proceeded to happen. 1 is that the would-be assassin crumpled to the floor, dead. 2 is that Hubert watched as Ferdinand jumped in front of him and took the arrow in Hubert's stead. He stumbled backwards, the shaft stuck out of his shoulder. Hubert's eyes widened slightly. "Did you just take an arrow for me?" the 2 asked at the same time. Ferdinand nodded, and Hubert scowled. "That was foolish," he said, but immediately inspected the wound. "Nothing major, but it would hurt. I don't want to stay here, but let me do something about that." Hubert didn't wait for Ferdinand's response before pulling the arrow out. Ferdinand hissed and tensed up, but Hubert already had a hand to the wound, pouring white magic into it. He hated using white magic. It was based on faith, something which he lacked dearly. But he had learned it still, in case someone needed help. It was a war, after all. He only regretted he didn't have the medical knowledge to match any of their other mages, as Ferdinand's face remained pale. "I can't do much more," Hubert admitted, taking his hand away. The wound had stopped bleeding mainly. "Still, this is help enough." Ferdinand smiled, although it lacked its usual radiance. "We should go, like you said." "Indeed," Hubert said, but he was worried. Judging by Ferdinand's pallor, there was likely poison involved. "Ferdinand?" "Yes, Hubert?" he asked, carefully lifting himself up onto his horse. Hubert cursed himself for what he was about to say. "You shouldn't ride alone. I should sit behind you." "But are you sure?" "You've most likely been poisoned. If you're alone on a horse, you could fall off and die, meaning my previous efforts to keep you alive are in vain." "You leave me with very little space to argue," Ferdinand sighed. This was how Hubert found himself on a horse, hurtling through the forest, with his arms wrapped around none other than Ferdinand von Eyre. It made Hubert feel rather warm. Of course, that was because of the fact he could feel Ferdinand's body heat. No other reason. After what felt like hours, they stopped at a stream so the horses could rest. Hubert dismounted first, then held out a hand so Ferdinand could dismount as well. He seemed shaky, but still alert. "You don't seem to be dying, which is fortunate," Hubert mused, getting first aid supplies out of his pack. "Now sit down so I can properly look at it." "Ah, you're glad I am not dying. How sweet," Ferdinand joked, but sat. Hubert sat opposite of him, and slid Ferdinand's shirt off his shoulder to see the wound. He carefully cleaned and bandaged the wound, being unusually gentle. "What possessed you to stand in front of an arrow meant for me?" Hubert asked, focused intensely on his task, unable to see Ferdinand's reactions. "Well, it was the logical decision. You're the only one between us that can use healing magic. Also, Ferdinand trailed off, then sighed. To be entirely honest with you, Hubert, I do not wish to see you hurt. Hubert paused for a minute, then regained himself. I'm sorry. Is that so hard to believe that after knowing you for so long, I consider you my friend? Ferdinand huffed. Hubert's voice was quiet in response. I suppose it is. I had never considered friendship a possibility between us. Well, what would you consider it now? Ferdinand asked. Hubert responded before he had the chance to reconsider his answer. Well, I think you're ridiculous. I have no objections to your friendship. Ha! It seems like this was worth it after all. Ferdinand laughed. Hubert leaned back to take in Ferdinand's stupid grin. If you are going to be so childish, I can retract my offer of friendship. Huh? No, wait! Your answer is as childish as mine. Did I pick your doppelganger back there? You're digging your hole deeper and deeper. Hubert couldn't help but smile, although he tried to return to his usual deadpan look quickly. Ferdinand jokingly pouted. You act as an excellent shovel, my friend. When they returned to base, Hubert did not have any more chances to talk to Ferdinand. All generals of the army were needed to plan the assault, Hubert and Ferdinand even more so than the others. The next time they talked was in the fort itself, after they rushed to defeat the previous Duke Eyre. Hubert had offered Ferdinand an out, and he had adamantly refused. That was respectable. Even so, Hubert worried about him. Ferdinand did not have the temperament required for patricide. Yet, Ferdinand still cut his father down where he stood. Hubert was glad Ferdinand's allegiances lay with Edelgard. He had come to almost be glad for the man's presence. He tended to brighten things up. A few days had passed since they had reclaimed the fort, and the army was still recuperating. For Hubert, that meant many a long day holed up in his office, working. He was told, rather frequently, to rest, but he had no other choice. Each and every task had to be finished before the next deployment. He wasn't one for rest anyway. It was one such day that Ferdinand barreled into his office, placed 2 cups on the table, then sat down on a spare chair. Hubert looked up from his work, quizzical. May I sit with you for a while? You seem to already be doing that. Hubert rolled his eyes. Ferdinand looked worse for wear. He had dark splotches under his eyes, his clothes were creased, and even his hair was unstyled. Hubert resisted the urge to reach over and run his fingers through it. But yes, you may stay. Thank you. I brought some of that coffee you like. I feel like if I brought you tea, I may be kicked right out. Ferdinand made an attempt to joke. It smelled like the rather expensive kind as well. Did Ferdinand buy that for him? Of course not. It was purely coincidental. Ferdinand was smart enough to not waste money on Hubert. You would indeed, Hubert chose to joke back, sipping the coffee. Much appreciated. You're welcome. The two sat in a rather awkward silence. Hubert sighed and placed his quill down. He should probably rest for a moment, and, to be frank, he was worried about Ferdinand. What brings you here anyway? I'm sure it's not for the company. Can't I want to spend my downtime in the company of a friend? I'm sure you can, but I'm also sure that's not the case. That's... Ferdinand sighed. You're right. Can I speak with you? Whatever for? Hubert raised an eyebrow, staring at Ferdinand, who seemed nervous. How do you deal with it? He burst out. Hubert wasn't any less confused. Deal with what, exactly? The blood of your father. On your hands, Ferdinand said, his voice unusually quiet. I know it needed to be done. My father was a traitor and an affront to all that I stand for. But logic doesn't chase away nightmares. I see, Hubert sighed. He shifted his chair so he was near Ferdinand, looking down at his own hands. First off, I must clarify that on all records, I did not kill my father. Hubert should have ended it there. Saying more would be a security breach of the most dangerous kind, but something about the way Ferdinand looked, like a light had been leached out of him and left behind a husk, twisted Hubert's heart and caused him pain he didn't quite understand. So he continued, But to answer your question, my situation is different to yours in many ways. I have not loved my father for a great many years, and I have always known that he would die for Edelgard's vision to be achieved. Hubert looked down at his own hands. Yet sometimes I still remember him telling me stories when I was young, or teaching me skills that I use to this day. As how to act, well, logic works for me, and I am not one for nightmares. Hubert was surprised at how much he said. He had never told anyone the truth, not even Edelgard. Ferdinand was watching Hubert intently the whole time, then nodded slowly. Thank you for telling me. Ferdinand returned to staring into his lap, fidgeting with his hands. Hubert sighed. hesitantly leaning over and placing his hand on top of Ferdinand's. "It will pass with time. The memories will fade, and you will see the good you wrought. Until then, you just survive." "You're right. You're right. You're right. Thank you," Ferdinand said. And was he? Flames. He was sniffling. Hubert used his other hand to gently wipe away Ferdinand's developing tears. They sat like that for a while, Hubert softly holding Ferdinand as he calmed down. "Thank you. I am very sorry you had to see me like this," Ferdinand apologized, sheepishly rubbing the back of his neck with one hand. He used his other hand to take hold of Hubert's, intertwining their fingers. "There's no need to apologize, except for crying on my glove. Now I'll have to wash it." Hubert sighed and shook his head. He wasn't being entirely serious. "But I must ask, why did you come to me? Surely I'm the last choice when it comes to these things." "You're my first choice, actually," Ferdinand admitted, and Hubert was taken aback. "And it seems I was right. You're a kind person when you want to be, Hubert." "I'm sure many would disagree." Hubert's laugh was dry. Being thought of as kind did not sit right with him whatsoever. "Well, then they would be wrong." "Even if it were I who disagreed?" "Then you would be wrong, for once." Ferdinand looked at Hubert and smiled. His smile was bright once more, and Hubert felt his heart beat harder. It was unfortunate that spending time with Ferdinand had such side effects. "I see. I'm glad you have trusted me enough to talk about this," Hubert responded. That was the normal thing people said in these situations, he was sure. "I hope I provided some solace. It's rather dull around here, with you not like yourself. You think it would be dull without me? All these compliments lately, the stress must truly be getting to you." Hubert rolled his eyes. Ferdinand truly must be feeling better if he was annoying again. "Perhaps if I had time to finish my work," he trailed off, looking at the pile of work that never seemed to shrink. Ferdinand glanced over at Hubert's stack of papers and blanched at the sight. "That much? Really? I thought that was what you had finished." "It's no matter. It all has to be finished, so it will be. But you never rest." "I can rest when we're traveling to our next destination." "That won't do. What if there's an ambush? If you should try to fight when lacking sleep, you'll make mistakes and get yourself injured." Ferdinand was so earnest in his worry that Hubert didn't have the heart to keep up the argument. He knew when a fight was impossible to win, and this was one. "What would you have me do, then?" Hubert asked, resignation in his tone. Ferdinand paused to think, then looked pleased with himself. Never a good sign. "I shall assist you. There must be tasks in there that I am capable of doing." That was true. There was a lot in there that covered more mundane topics, some of which Ferdinand may even understand better than Hubert. But still, Hubert wasn't sure he wanted to delegate the tasks. They were entrusted to him, and he just did not have to trust in others' work, especially Ferdinand's. Yet, there was no one around he wanted to help him other than Ferdinand at the moment. He sighed. "Fine." Soon, Ferdinand and Hubert were seated at opposite sides of the cramped desk, both with piles of paperwork. Their drinks had long since gone cold, but neither noticed. They worked quietly, with nothing but the sound of scratching quills and the occasional question thrown at the other. It was efficient, and surprisingly enjoyable, not to mention the fact that at the rate they were going, Hubert could likely afford to dine with the others and sleep an unusually long time that evening. As time passed, they found themselves in a passionate discussion about some noble topic or another. By the time he explained the story to Shez, Hubert couldn't remember what the conversation was about. What he did remember, and rather strongly at that, was the fact that they leant further and further across the desk as they debated. It wasn't long before Ferdinand's face was directly in front of Hubert's own, and he was struggling to think of rebuttals when all he could think of was how pretty Ferdinand looked. He was hopeless, getting distracted that easily, thinking about how Ferdinand's hair perfectly framed his features, about how soft his lips looked. Hubert couldn't help himself. He leaned forward just a bit more. His lips grazed Ferdinand's for one sweet moment, but he panicked. Hubert drew back quickly, able to hear his own pounding heart in his ears. Ferdinand looked at Hubert with wide eyes. Greatly, one of the only friendships he had managed to gain, lost because of one foolish decision. But the shock on Ferdinand's face gave way to something else. His eyes softened, and he had his stupid beaming smile. Ferdinand leaned over the whole desk as Hubert instinctually slid back more. In response, Ferdinand came closer, except he lost his balance, clumsily falling onto the desk. Papers, meticulously sorted, flew in every direction. In any other circumstance, Hubert would be mad, but looking down at Ferdinand's hapless expression and sprawled-out limbs, he couldn't do anything but laugh. "Ugh, laughing at my pain, are we?" Ferdinand groaned, slowly picking himself up and detaching himself from the multitude of papers stuck to his shirt. My apologies. Hubert stopped laughing, but he could feel the grin on his face. Come now, don't leave me to tidy all this up myself, Ferdinand whined. What lucky timing that fall was. Now they could pretend it never happened and go back to the way things used to be. Hubert stood up and began to sort the papers left on the desk. He focused on the task, blocking any distracting thoughts from his mind. It wasn't safe for long, however, as Ferdinand reached a hand out and held Hubert's shoulder. Hubert, what is it? Am I correct in remembering you just kissed me, right? What a stupid question. What would Ferdinand say if he just said no? Perhaps he was giving Hubert an out. But Hubert was never the kind to take an out. An astute observation, Ferdinand, Hubert shot out, to which Ferdinand only nodded. I'm glad. What? Before Hubert could question him any further, Ferdinand pulled Hubert towards him. Their lips met, this time lingering. It was awkward and clunky, not helped by the desk between them, but it sent Hubert's pulse racing. When their lips disconnected, they simply stared at one another. For a moment, neither moved. Ferdinand tilted his head so that his forehead rested on Hubert's. Hubert, I love you. I think you should know that. Hubert did not know how to respond, so he froze, mumbling his words in a way that was rather unbecoming. Please don't say that. But why? Ferdinand asked, and Hubert heard a twinge of hurt in his voice. It hurt Hubert to hear Ferdinand like that. It broke the dam inside him. Because you deserve better than me. My hands are stained with what I've done. Quite literally. Dark magic left scars kept hidden under pristine gloves. But you are bright, my son, and you deserve someone like you, full of joy and color. It's because I love you that— Hubert von Vestra! Ferdinand's tone was strict, and he took both of Hubert's hands in his own. If you do not shut up and accept the fact that I love you, that you are the thing that will make me happy, I will pick you up and throw you from the battlements. The threat did not sound empty. Hubert was stunned into silence, but whether it was from Ferdinand's declaration of love or his encroaching acrophobia was unclear. I would prefer if you did not do that, personally, Hubert huffed. Ferdinand laughed quietly, and Hubert could feel his breath. It was warm and oddly comforting, tickling his skin. Hubert wasn't used to being this close to another person. Then? Yes, Ferdinand, I have come to the conclusion that we both seem to love each other. How fascinating. Fascinating indeed, Ferdinand said, then leaned in for another kiss. It was sufficient to say that Hubert did finish his work that day. He was rather distracted, but he found he didn't mind. Doing work with Ferdinand, sitting across from him, was more enjoyable. In the end, Edelgard had picked up on it swiftly, of course. Hubert couldn't hide anything from her. But she was happy for them both, a fact which made Hubert glad, if not a bit embarrassed. Ferdinand, huh? Never would have guessed, Shez exclaimed, her eyes shining. She was rather childish, despite her strength. Hubert found it oddly endearing. Yes, Ferdinand. But the two of you are always arguing, right? I prefer to consider them spirited debates. In truth, they used to be arguments. Now, they were almost enjoyable little conversations. Is it not a sign of respect that we can speak our minds without fear of consequences? Shez seemed to ponder that, then nodded. That's a really good thing, actually. I guess you're right. I'm often right. Now shoo, I have work to be doing. Fine, Shez pouted, then walked away, waving. Enjoy paperwork or whatever. Hubert sighed, a fond smile on his face. When he chose this path, he expected it to be a rather lonely one, only Edelgard at his side, and even then holding her an arm's length away. Turns out, it's awfully easy to grow attached to people without realizing it, until it was too late. He had let himself find friendship, find love, the ways he had only thought about in passing. It made trying to win a war a lot more difficult when you had so many to protect, but he wouldn't have it any other way. And one day, when this war was all over, he would get to wake up to the smile he fell in love with every day.